Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Everyday English Channel with Tom and Kate. We're really happy to have you with us today.
Yes, thanks for being here again. Today we're going to talk about something that happens all the time, whether you're traveling, starting a new job, moving to a new city, or simply meeting new people. We're talking about meeting someone for the first time.
That's true. And I think many English learners feel nervous about these situations because first impressions seem important. People often worry about saying the right thing, finding the right words, or avoiding awkward silences. But honestly, first conversations are usually much simpler than people imagine.
Exactly. And before we continue, if you enjoy these calm and practical English conversations, you can subscribe to the channel or share this episode with someone who is learning English. It really helps us, and we really appreciate it.
So let me ask you something. When you meet someone for the first time, are you usually the person who starts the conversation, or do you prefer waiting for the other person to speak first?
Honestly, I usually wait. I'm friendly once the conversation starts, but I'm not normally the first person to walk up and introduce myself. I prefer letting the conversation happen naturally. I think I'm simply more comfortable once someone breaks the ice.
That's interesting because I'm almost the opposite. If nobody starts talking, I'll usually say hello first. Not because I'm extremely outgoing, but because I know the first few seconds are often the hardest part. Once someone smiles and answers, everything immediately feels more relaxed.
Yes, and actually, break the ice is a wonderful expression. People use it all the time when talking about first meetings. It simply means doing or saying something that makes everyone feel more comfortable. Sometimes it's a joke. Sometimes it's just asking a simple question.
Another thing I've noticed is that first conversations usually begin with very predictable questions. People say things like, "Hi, I'm Tom. Nice to meet you." Or they ask, "What's your name?" Or, "Where are you from?" They're simple questions, but they appear in almost every first conversation.
Yes, and one expression you'll hear constantly is, "Nice to meet you." It sounds polite, friendly, and natural. The other person usually replies with something similar like, "Nice to meet you too," or "It's nice to meet you." And honestly, those few words immediately create a positive atmosphere.
After introducing themselves, people often ask where you're from. That's probably one of the most common questions in English. Someone might say, "So, where are you from?" And then the conversation naturally continues from there.
I like that question because the answer often creates new topics. If someone says they're from another country or another city, people immediately become curious. They might ask, "How long have you lived here?" Or, "What brought you here?" Without realizing it, the conversation starts growing naturally.
That's true. Another question you hear a lot is, "What do you do?" At first, some learners think people are asking what you're doing at that exact moment, but actually they're asking about your job or profession. It's one of the most common questions adults ask when meeting for the first time.
Yes, and people usually answer very simply. They might say, "I work in banking," or "I'm a teacher," or "I'm studying at university." You don't need a long explanation. A short answer is completely normal. And if the other person is interested, they'll ask another question.
Another thing I find interesting is how important body language is during first meetings. People smile, make eye contact, shake hands in some situations, or simply wave and say hello. Even before anyone says very much, those small actions already make the conversation feel warmer.
I completely agree. And I think first conversations become much easier when you remember that the other person is probably just as nervous as you are. Most people aren't looking for perfect English. They're simply hoping for a friendly, comfortable conversation.
Exactly. And that's why meeting someone for the first time is actually one of the easiest everyday conversations in English. The questions are familiar, the answers are usually short, and both people are simply trying to get to know each other a little better.
Once the introductions are over, people usually start looking for something they have in common. The conversation naturally moves away from names and jobs and becomes a little more personal. Someone might ask, "Have you lived here for a long time?" Or, "Is this your first time here?" I like those questions because they're easy to answer, and they often lead to interesting conversations.
Yes, especially when people are meeting at an event, a conference, or even a party. One of the most common questions is simply, how do you know the host? I've heard that question so many times, and what's nice is that there's no complicated answer needed. You might say, we work together, or we went to university together, or we've been friends for years.
That's true. Another question that comes up quite often is, "What brings you here?" I really like that expression because it works in many situations. Someone might ask it if you've just moved to a new city, if you're traveling, or if you're attending an event. And again, the answers are usually very simple. You might say, "I'm here for work," "I'm on holiday," or "I'm visiting some friends."
Yes. And something I've noticed is that people often become more relaxed once they discover a shared interest. Maybe they both enjoy traveling, they support the same sports team, or they have similar hobbies. Suddenly, the conversation becomes much easier because both people are genuinely interested in the topic.
I completely agree. And honestly, asking about hobbies is one of the safest ways to keep a conversation going. Questions like, "What do you like doing in your free time?" or "Do you have any hobbies?" are very common. They're open questions so the other person can answer in many different ways.
Yes, and what I like is that people don't usually give one-word answers. If someone says, I enjoy hiking, the other person naturally becomes curious. They might ask, how often do you go? Or, what's your favorite place to hike? Without really thinking about it, the conversation starts developing on its own.
Another thing I've noticed is that people often ask follow-up questions instead of changing the subject immediately. For example, if someone tells me they're learning a new language, I'll probably ask, "How long have you been learning?" Or, "What made you choose that language?" I think those follow-up questions show genuine interest.
Yes, and they also make the conversation feel balanced. Nobody enjoys feeling like they're answering questions in an interview. A good conversation usually goes back and forth naturally. One person shares something, the other reacts, asks a question, and then shares something similar from their own experience.
That's a really good point. People sometimes think they need to ask lots of questions, but it's equally important to share something about yourself. If someone asks where you're from, you answer the question, but you can also add a small detail. For example, "I'm from France. It's a beautiful country, especially if you enjoy history and food." That little extra information gives the other person something to react to.
Exactly. If your answers are a little more complete, the conversation flows much more naturally. Instead of stopping after every question, it keeps moving without feeling forced.
Another thing people often do during first meetings is find something positive to comment on. Maybe they say, "That's an interesting job," or "That sounds like a great place to live," or "I've always wanted to visit there." Those comments help create a friendly atmosphere because they show curiosity rather than simply asking another question.
Yes, and I think listening is just as important as speaking. Sometimes people become so focused on thinking about their next sentence that they stop listening to the other person completely. But if you really pay attention, the conversation almost continues by itself because every answer gives you another possible topic.
That's very true. Meeting someone for the first time isn't about saying impressive things. It's simply about showing interest, listening carefully, and enjoying a relaxed conversation where both people slowly get to know each other.
Another thing people often wonder about is how long a first conversation should last. Personally, I don't think there's a perfect answer. Sometimes you speak for 5 minutes and then naturally move on. Other times, you end up talking for an hour because you discover so many things in common. I think the important thing is letting the conversation develop naturally instead of worrying about how long it should be.
I completely agree, and honestly, first conversations usually become easier after the first couple of minutes. At the beginning, both people are trying to understand each other. They're learning names, asking a few basic questions, and figuring out what they have in common. Once that happens, people usually stop thinking so much about what to say next.
Another thing I've noticed is that humor often appears naturally. Nobody starts telling complicated jokes immediately, but small funny comments can make everyone feel more relaxed. For example, if you both get lost trying to find the same meeting room, someone might laugh and say, "Well, at least we got lost together." Those little moments often help people feel comfortable very quickly.
Yes, and I think people sometimes worry too much about awkward silences. But honestly, a few seconds of silence aren't a problem. It's completely normal to pause for a moment while thinking about what to say next. In fact, many good conversations include small pauses. They make the discussion feel natural instead of rushed.
That's true. And if the conversation slows down, you can always ask another simple question. For example, "Have you been here before?" "What do you usually do on weekends?" Or, "Have you tried the food here yet?" Those kinds of questions feel very natural because they relate to the situation you're already sharing.
Yes, I like questions that connect to what's happening around you. If you're at a conference, you can ask which talk they enjoyed most. If you're traveling, you can ask whether they visited other places nearby. If you're at a cafe, you might simply ask whether they've been there before. The environment itself often gives you the next topic without needing to think too hard.
Another thing people often do is find similarities. Someone says, "I enjoy hiking," and the other person replies, "Really? I love hiking too." Or maybe someone says they have children, enjoy cooking, or recently started learning another language. Those shared experiences immediately make the conversation feel warmer because both people suddenly have something familiar to talk about.
Absolutely. And sometimes the opposite happens. You discover that your interests are completely different, but that can also create an interesting conversation. If someone tells me they enjoy mountain climbing, I might say, "I've never tried that. What's it like?" I'm genuinely curious because it's something I don't know much about.
I like that approach. People don't always need to have identical hobbies to enjoy talking together. Sometimes asking someone to explain their passion creates an even better conversation than talking about something you already know. And I think people appreciate genuine curiosity much more than pretending to know everything.
Another thing I've realized is that confidence doesn't necessarily mean talking a lot. Some of the friendliest people I've met actually speak quite calmly. They listen carefully, smile, ask thoughtful questions, and make the other person feel comfortable. That's often much more memorable than someone who speaks constantly without listening.
I completely agree. A good conversation isn't about trying to impress someone. It's about making both people feel relaxed enough to enjoy talking together. When that happens, the conversation usually flows naturally without either person making a big effort.
And I think that's why first meetings become easier with experience. The more people you meet, the more you realize that everyone feels a little uncertain at the beginning. After a few minutes, those feelings usually disappear because you're no longer talking to a stranger. You're simply talking to another person.
Exactly. And once you understand that, meeting someone for the first time becomes much less intimidating. Instead of worrying about saying the perfect thing, you can simply enjoy getting to know someone new, one conversation at a time.
When you look at all these situations together, meeting someone for the first time is really about making a good connection, not about having perfect English. Most first conversations follow the same natural pattern. You introduce yourself, ask a few simple questions, discover a little about each other, and see where the conversation goes. The language itself is usually much simpler than people expect.
I completely agree. And I think many learners put too much pressure on themselves. They worry about making grammar mistakes or forgetting a word. But the other person is usually paying much more attention to the conversation than to the English itself. If you smile, show interest, and communicate clearly, people generally remember that much more than a small language mistake.
That's a really important point. Another thing I've noticed is that people appreciate authenticity. You don't need to sound especially funny, intelligent, or interesting. Simply being yourself is usually enough. If you genuinely enjoy traveling, reading, cooking, or sports, talk about those things naturally instead of trying to invent impressive stories.
Yes, because people usually recognize genuine enthusiasm. When someone talks about something they truly enjoy, the conversation becomes more engaging automatically. You can hear it in their voice, and it's much easier to ask follow-up questions because their interest feels real.
Another thing I like about first conversations is that they often lead to unexpected topics. Maybe you begin by talking about work, and 5 minutes later you're discussing favorite holiday destinations, books you've enjoyed, or foods you've never tried before. That's one of the reasons conversations are so enjoyable. You never really know where they'll end up.
Exactly. And sometimes one small comment completely changes the direction of the discussion. Someone casually mentions learning the guitar, running their first marathon, or planning a trip abroad, and suddenly you spend the next 15 minutes talking about that instead. That's why listening carefully is so valuable. Small details often become the most interesting part of the conversation.
Another thing people sometimes forget is that it's perfectly normal not to agree about everything. You might have different hobbies, different opinions, or completely different lifestyles. That doesn't stop you from having a pleasant conversation. In fact, respectfully discovering different perspectives often makes the discussion even more interesting.
I agree. You don't need to find someone exactly like yourself. Curiosity is much more important than similarity. If you ask questions with genuine interest and listen to the answers, people usually enjoy the conversation, even if your lives are very different.
Another situation that happens quite often is saying goodbye after the conversation. People sometimes worry about ending a conversation politely, but the expressions are usually very simple. You might say, "It was really nice meeting you," or "It was great talking with you." Those sentences sound warm, friendly, and completely natural.
Yes, and if you think you'll see the person again, you might add something like, "I hope we talk again soon," or "Enjoy the rest of your day." If you're at an event, people often say, "Enjoy the conference," or "Have a great evening." Those little phrases leave a very positive final impression.
And honestly, I think that's something worth remembering. People don't usually remember every sentence from a first conversation. They remember how the conversation made them feel. If it felt relaxed, friendly, and genuine, they'll probably be happy to talk to you again in the future.
That's very true. And when you think about it, meeting someone for the first time isn't really about finding the perfect words. It's about showing kindness, curiosity, and respect while getting to know another person. Those qualities exist in every language, and English is no different.
Exactly. Once you become comfortable with a few common introductions, simple questions, and natural follow-up conversations, meeting new people in English becomes much less intimidating and much more enjoyable.
Before we finish, thank you very much for spending this time with us today.
We hope this conversation helps you feel more comfortable introducing yourself and meeting new people in English.
If you enjoyed this episode, you can subscribe to the channel or share it with someone who is learning English.
It really helps us grow, and we truly appreciate your support.
Join us in the next episode for another calm and practical English conversation.
Thanks again for listening.
And remember, keep speaking English every day.